Chapter 9. Cemeteries. Rolling green fields where the dead are laid to rest, marked out with stone, granite, or marble headstones, engraved so that those who came to pay their respects, or simply passers-by, can identify the deceased beneath the ground. Ironically, a place filled with death, both old and recent, was also one of the most tranquil and serene places in all of Los Angeles. Only a few people strolled through the cemetery. A few people come to pay their respects and visit the graves of loved ones. The older graves, worn and weathered by time and the elements, stood neglected, little more than part of the scenery, those who'd mourned their occupants long since having departed themselves. Another grave had been dug, a normal occurrence in the cemetery, the circle of life and death so unending that new ones were dug all the time. A funeral took place halfway down a gentle slope in the cemetery, though anyone who saw it in passing might wonder who was so unpopular as to only have 4 people present at their burial, one of those being the priest conducting the ceremony. Sarah stood beside Ellison, who held Savannah's hand as they looked on at the coffin before them. Father Bonilla stood at the head of the casket and read a passage from his Bible. Sarah didn't recognize it, not having been to any funerals herself, barring the one for the desert heat and air workers. And she'd been too busy looking for leads to bother listening to the droning on about the life everlasting after death. Not that she really believed in any of that stuff, anyway. All 3 of them were dressed in black, not difficult for Ellison, whose time in the bureau had shaped his wardrobe as such, though Sarah had had to go shopping once more for outfits for herself and Savannah, something she'd hated every minute of, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. Even with the cover of newly blonde hair and a pair of reading glasses or sunglasses, and a hat, she'd felt every pair of eyes boring down on her, convinced somebody would recognize her. Savannah looked down at the coffin, a deep sadness etched into her face and a pink puffiness in her eyes, which were on the verge of tears. Sarah noticed the girl's face and leaned down to whisper, "She's just sleeping." Savannah looked up at Sarah and shook her head. "That's what everyone said about Daddy," she replied sadly. "People said he was sleeping, but she knew he wasn't coming back." "She really is sleeping," Sarah told her. She squeezed the tiny hand that Ellison wasn't holding and crouched down. "Did your daddy ever tell you the story of Sleeping Beauty?" Savannah nodded slowly. "Well, that's what this is. Cameron's going to sleep for a long time, and my son John's going to find her one day and wake her up." She knew that's what would happen. Whether she stopped the war or not, John would find Cameron. He'd find her chip and he'd get her back. Her son was like a bulldog with a bone in its mouth when he set his mind to something. Nothing would get in his way. "Is he going to kiss her?" Savannah asked. That was how the prince woke up Sleeping Beauty in the story. Sarah choked and spluttered at Savannah's question. It was completely innocent, but the thought of John and Cameron, she wrestled the thought out of her head. She'd literally had no choice but to accept John's feelings for Cameron and let him go, but she didn't even want to think about how that might actually play out when he found her. The amount of time John had spent with her lately had been worrying. "He'd better not," Sarah mumbled to herself. Savannah looked up to Ellison for confirmation. "She's right," he told her. "John's going to wake Cameron up, years from now. But until then, she has to sleep." Sarah smiled to herself when Savannah seemed satisfied with their explanation. She let go of Savannah's hand, stood back up and approached Father Bonilla, who'd been performing the funeral despite the fact none of the 3 mourners had listened to a word he'd said. He closed his Bible and held it in both hands in front of him, his head bowed. "Are they in there?" Sarah asked him quietly. "Yes, she is buried with all the weapons you gave me. I kept the coffin closed so nobody would see them." Father Bonilla had worked tirelessly since Sarah had asked for his help once more. He'd called the local funeral directors, who'd only been able to supply a large coffin for a man twice Cameron's size. He'd called Sarah to tell her, and she'd been perfectly happy with that. When she'd driven to his church again with a trunk full of weaponry, he'd then placed all the guns underneath and around Cameron's body. He'd been aghast at the sight of the metal skull underneath the delicate girlish features, and had muttered away in quiet prayer as he'd worked. He'd never imagined such things could exist, nor that he'd be helping a woman to bury such a machine alongside a small armory. They'd not covered anything like that when he'd been training for the priesthood, but despite her record and reputation, Father Benilla sensed Sarah was a good person. He believed her, and believed what she was trying to do was right, which was why he'd agreed to help her one more time. They watched as the coffin descended into the hole in the ground and stood sentinel as the earth was piled into the grave, filling it up. Once the soil was patted down over the fresh grave, Father Benilla had one more question to ask. "The headstone won't be ready for another 2 weeks. I don't know the girl's name." Sarah had never mentioned her daughter's name to him before. Sarah paused for a moment. She wondered if she should use a name John would recognize. Cameron Baum could be too easily traced, as could the surnames Reese and Phillips. She tried to think of something else, something John would be able to pick up if he saw it. "Amelia Kearns," Ellison told the priest. "Make up the birth date." Sarah looked at him strangely. "Who's that?" "First girl I dated in high school," he replied. "The name can't be linked to you, John or Cameron, and unless someone stalked me since I was 14, they won't connect it to me either." "Not bad," Sarah muttered. "Do it," she told Benilla. "Amelia Kearns. Make up something nice to write on the stone, too." Sarah nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. "We won't ask you for anything else." Benilla had done so much for her already, but it wasn't his war and she wouldn't involve him in it. It wasn't fair on him. It was her burden, hers and Ellison's, she reminded herself, still unused to the fact she had a partner in crime now, and she wouldn't put it on anyone else's shoulders. Sarah turned from the grave and led Ellison and Savannah away from it and Father Benilla, resolving that she'd never see him again. Sarah put her fork back down on the empty plate and savored the sweet, spicy taste of the crispy chili chicken and noodles. She sat back at the table, full now, and reflected that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Not since John had gone. She'd picked through Ellison's fridge or bought a sandwich, but she hadn't actually eaten a full meal, and she couldn't help but let out a small, gratified moan as she finished her plate. "That good, huh?" Ellison asked as he picked delicately at his sweet and sour pork, and Savannah next to him did the same with hers. Both of them were only halfway through their meals, unlike Sarah, who demolished hers as fast as possible. "Surprised you even tasted it. It went down that fast." "It's the training," she explained. One of the first things she'd learnt in South America. We had to eat fast in case something came up and we had to move. We never knew when we'd get the chance again. Ellison shrugged at it and looked down at Savannah, who'd been extremely quiet during and since the fake funeral. "You okay?" Savannah just nodded and took another small bite of her food. She wasn't really hungry and started idly pushing the food around on the plate. "I want to go home," she said sadly. She missed her mommy, her bed and her toys. She even missed school. She hadn't seen her friends in a long time. "It's not safe," Sarah said softly, surprising Ellison at the gentle tone of her voice. Savannah simply nodded and stared into space, pushing her plate away to show she was finished despite half the meal remaining. She didn't pout or cry or argue, and it broke Sarah's heart. Most kids would have screamed or begged until they got what she wanted, but Savannah had just quietly accepted it. She wondered what living with an emotionless, cold machine for however long, and thinking it was her mother would do to a kid that young. She probably never answered back because she was too scared to. "Savannah, can you leave me and Mr. Ellison alone for a moment? Go upstairs and run a bath. I'll see you up there in a minute." Savannah nodded once and left Ellison's kitchen to head to the living room. Once she was gone and hopefully out of earshot, Sarah turned to her opposite, still slowly eating his sweet and sour pork. "We're heading back to Sierra Corp tonight." Ellison finished chewing his food and swallowed before making his reply. "Why?" he asked. "Kaliba, if those guys were Kaliba, they were," Sarah interrupted. "Well, they're going to be crawling all over that place. What did you want to go in there for anyway?" "We need information," Sarah said simply. "We're pretty sure Kaliba's working with Skynet. Or for it, you said John Henry had a brother, so that must be it. But that's all we know right now. We don't know where they are, what they are doing, or how many of them there are. I promised John I'd stop Judgment Day, but I don't even know where to start. We gotta get in there and find out what we can as soon as possible." Ellison looked at Sarah for a moment, realizing she was right. He sat in silence for a minute as he continued to finish his meal off, then washed it down with the rest of his glass of diet soda as Sarah watched him impatiently. "You done?" she asked. Apparently, they didn't have a sense of urgency in the FBI, probably why they hadn't caught her since she'd broken out of Pescadero. Ellison put his glass down and nodded. "You said it yourself," he nodded down at his now empty plate. "You never know when you might get to eat next." Sarah ran her fingers through Savannah's hair, gently working the shampoo into it and looking down at the girl, still so quiet. "Did your mommy ever do this with you?" Sarah asked. Shit, she admonished herself for using past tense. She didn't want Savannah to think her mother wasn't coming back. No kid should ever have to lose their parents at that age. "She used to," Savannah replied quietly. "Used to? How long ago was that?" "Before Daddy died," she said. "How did he die?" Sarah asked. She could practically see the cops one day discovering the real Catherine Weaver and her husband, run through by blades and dumped in a ditch or in the sewer somewhere. "He was flying, he crashed," Savannah said with a sniffle. Sarah decided to stop that line of questioning. She didn't want to upset her anymore. It was hard enough being dragged into hiding like this, even for herself and Ellison, let alone a little girl. Savannah leaned back into the bath and rinsed her own hair without Sarah's help. She then took a cloth and started to wash herself. Sarah wondered how long ago Savannah Weaver had been unwittingly orphaned, how long she'd lived with a machine that hadn't the first clue how to look after a child, for Savannah to start acting so independently like that. "Hey, think fast." Sarah scooped up some of the bubbles in one hand and slathered them on Savannah's face before she could react. Savannah looked up at her in surprise, with bubbles sticking to her jaw and chin, but she continued and picked up more bubbles. "Guess I better do the other side, too," she said as she put more on, creating a bubble beard. She picked up a mirror from the windowsill by the sink and showed Savannah. Savannah giggled in glee at the sight of herself, and Sarah had to admit she was enjoying spending time with Savannah, doing things a mother would do. She'd missed out on things like this with John, but she'd give Savannah at least a semblance of being a kid for as long as she could. She wondered if maybe John had a point when he'd said he'd never had a chance to live his life. Maybe she should have let him enjoy the time they had for a while, even just some time off once in a while. She wasn't going to make the same mistake with Savannah. After a few more minutes of Savannah splashing in the tub, Sarah got her out, gave her a towel, and let her dry herself off. Once Savannah was dry and dressed, Sarah took her downstairs and into Ellison's living room. Savannah sat down on the sofa, and Sarah gave her the TV remote. Sarah watched as Savannah channel surfed, looking to find something she wanted to see. She went into Ellison's kitchen and looked around for snacks. She found a large bottle of Coke, some chips, popcorn, and a tub of ice cream. She pulled out the ice cream, noting that it was chocolate, and took it and a spoon to Savannah. The girl was very independent for her age, And Sarah knew that was what she needed her to be right now. "Find anything good?" she asked. Savannah seemed to be glued to some show or film with a girl singing. She'd seen it in passing, but had no idea what it was. Hannah something or other. Savannah nodded, and despite her earlier claims of being full, her eyes widened as Sarah passed her the tub of ice cream. She eagerly ripped the lid off and started to dig in, so quickly and carelessly that some of it missed and smeared against her chin. Sarah couldn't help but smile at it. "Me and Mr. Ellison are going to go out for a few hours. Are you going to be okay here?" Savannah nodded absently, immersed in the ice cream and the TV. "When we're gone, don't answer the door to anyone. Understand?" "Okay," she replied. "Good girl." Sarah ruffled Savannah's red hair affectionately, then left the living room. She opened the front door and saw Ellison already waiting in the driver's seat of the Mercedes. Sarah made sure she locked the door behind her and got into the car. Ellison calmly pulled off and drove through the streets, heading towards downtown. "Think we did the right thing, leaving Savannah alone?" he asked. "We can't exactly take her with us," Sarah said. Not just because it was dangerous, but she didn't want Savannah to see and go through everything John had. Not unless she had to. They reached the downtown area of Los Angeles, and the giant skyscrapers loomed over them menacingly. The night air was pitch black and illuminated by tens of thousands of lights, both street lights and those in offices, still occupied, despite the lateness of the evening that served to remind Sarah the electricity was back on, and with it, the myriad surveillance cameras that littered the city. Ellison drove further through downtown, and before long the Zyracorp Tower emerged into view, towering over them but with a stark difference between it and the other skyscrapers. All the lights in Zyracorp were off, and even in the dark Sarah managed to make out the burnt black hole in the side of the tower at the top where the drone had crashed. Sarah couldn't help but think that if they didn't stop Skynet before Judgment Day, the rest of LA would be as dark and lifeless as the tower. "Drive by the front entrance," Sarah told Ellison. He turned off towards the building and drove steadily forward. He didn't speed up or slow down as they drove before the front of Zyracorp, but maintained a steady speed and concentrated solely on the road, while Sarah stared out her window at the building. He'd done surveillance before and knew that a drive-by observation had to be done precisely. Drive too fast and you might miss something. Drive too slow and someone watching might catch on to what you're doing. Sarah looked out of her window intently at the inert building. As it had seemed from afar, the tower was completely dark, and the crash site at the top was a mess of burnt and broken metal and concrete, blackened and charred by fire and smoke. Sarah saw black and yellow police tape wrapped around the front entrance, sealing it off from the public. She couldn't see any of the SWAT guys who'd been there the other day, but then again they'd stick out, she thought. Chances were the same guys were probably staking out the area in plain clothes, right now. They drove past the entrance to the underground employee parking lot, and Sarah noticed the gate had been rammed down at some point. She couldn't make out anything else from the outside, and within seconds they'd driven past the building. "Where's the nearest parking lot?" Sarah asked. "Employee parking, but that's probably guarded," Ellison replied. "Other than that, you're looking a few blocks away." Sarah thought for a moment. "Turn right," she instructed Ellison as they approached the intersection. Ellison did as he was told and turned to the right, driving steadily in their new direction. "What are we looking for?" Ellison asked. "Alleyway," Sarah said, pointing up ahead to the right. They drove up by the block, and they saw the entrance to the alley that bisected the block. Ellison signaled to turn into it, but Sarah gripped the wheel and held it firm. "Keep going," she told him. She'd spotted the alleyway. That'd do for now. "Find somewhere nearby to park." Ellison drove on down past several more blocks, before finding a multi-story parking lot. They parked up on the second floor, and Ellison made to open the trunk, but Sarah stopped him. "We don't need the rifles," she told him. "Seriously?" Ellison raised his eyebrow at her. "Why did we just spend 45 grand on enough guns to invade a small country if we don't need them?" Sarah pulled out her Glock 17 and pulled back the top slide slightly, checking there was a round chambered. She released it with a metallic click and looked at him. "I've got 2 spare magazines. You?" Ellison opened the glove compartment and pulled out a SIG P226, plus 2 spare magazines. "Same," he replied. Sarah gestured at the assault rifles in the back. "We can't walk around out in the open with them, and if we get to the point where we need assault rifles, we're screwed anyway." "This is just recon," she told him. Skynet wasn't here. She'd found that out very well the last time she was here. But there might be something they could find that might tell them about Kaliba Ellison. Didn't know anything about them, but Sarah couldn't believe Weaver would be ignorant. She knew something, and she resolved to find out whatever she could. They left the car, locked it, and made their way down the stairwell, ignoring the handful of drunk vagrants staggering around and talking in groups, to themselves, or to whatever invisible pink dragons happened to be floating around. Both Sarah and Ellison screwed up their faces as they passed by one drunken man, sat in a corner with a bottle of cheap vodka in a plastic carrier bag. He stank of urine and body odor. Sarah kept a close eye on him for a second, making sure he actually was drunk. The sudden thought came to her that a tramp was the perfect disguise. A cop or Fed or someone working for Kaliba could easily pose as a vagrant, pretend to be shit-faced drunk, and watch their movements. There could easily be a camera in the bag with the vodka. Or a gun. Sarah took in his features. His weather-beaten leathery skin, his scraggly gray beard, and his torn blue jeans with filthy gray sweater. If she saw the same man again anywhere else, but on their return visit, she knew to put him down. "How are we going to get inside?" Ellison asked her. "There are security cameras around every entrance, and if there are people inside, they'll see us breaking in." The vagrant behind them belched and threw his bottle of empty vodka against a concrete pillar, shattering it with a loud crash of glass and catching Sarah's attention. She turned around and approached him. "Wha the fuck you want?" The man slurred at Sarah, revealing broken stumps of brown teeth and rancid breath that reeked of alcohol. There was no way, she realized, that this guy was posing as a drunk. If he was then, he deserved an Oscar for the effort he was putting in. Even his skin stank of booze. Sarah reached into her jeans pocket and pulled out her purse. She opened it and pulled out a $50 bill, holding it up in front of the vagrant. "How'd you like to make $50? She asked. The tramp stared at her, then Ellison, and finally at the money. His alcohol-addled brain trying to decide if he'd heard her right or not. He was wasted, but not so far gone that he couldn't work out that $50 could buy him a lot more juice. He grinned, revealing his rotten teeth once more, and let out a throaty chuckle as he slowly, unsteadily dragged himself up off the ground and onto his feet. "What you want me to do?" Knowles sat back in his chair behind the security desk. An array of screens displayed images from several points throughout the building. Outside the main entrance, inside the lobby, all of the fire exits, and the inside of the employee parking lot. Nothing showed up, just the same still images over and over again. Knowles sighed and took a sip from his cup of coffee, scowling as he realized the drink was cold. He was bored, seriously bored. He was supposed to be protecting Danny Dyson while he worked on God only knew what. But Danny was safe and secure down in the basement and had shown he was far happier without Knowles and his team bothering him. There weren't any cameras in the basement. Apparently Sierra Corp's most secret work had been conducted there. But Danny had a radio and could easily enough call for them if he needed anything. In the last 2 days, though, Knowles hadn't heard a peep from the young man, and only saw him when he personally went to hand him some food twice a day and check on his progress. Not that anything Danny said about his work meant a damn thing to Knowles anyway. His trade was in bullets and blades, and Danny's was in circuits and microchips. Knowles put down his coffee and took a bite of the sandwich he'd taken from the vending machine and thought about the differences between them. He'd seen Danny's Porsche 911 and the tailored suits and wondered if he'd made the right career choices in his life. Maybe I'll take a computer course after this job's over, he thought to himself. Not that he was paid badly, of course. Kaliba had contracted him for $500 a day, twice the rate a lot of guys on the circuit earned. But Danny's trade clearly made a lot more money for a lot less hardship. Movement on one of the screens caught his eye, and Knowles put down the sandwich as he focused on the display. Someone was outside the fire exit C, on the rear of the ground floor. Knowles pressed a couple of keys on the console, and the camera zoomed in on the man. Knowles breathed easy as he saw the man. It was just a bum, probably wasted out of his skull. Knowles watched with interest as the man staggered towards the fire exit door and leaned his head against it. Knowles wasn't worried. The door couldn't be opened from the outside. The bum unzipped his flies and started to take a piss against the door, swaying drunkenly as he did so. The camera resolution was high enough that Knowles could see he was splashing himself as he peed. "Winos," he chuckled and rolled his eyes as the man was too drunk to realize he was spattering himself with his own piss. The bum pulled something out of his jacket, and Knowles' eyes narrowed. The vagrant pulled out a lead pipe from under his jacket and turned towards the security camera, not realizing his zip was still undone. The image shook as the bum smashed the pipe into the camera, and then again as he struck it a second time. He swung the pipe a third time, and the camera went dead. "Son of a bitch," Knowles growled as he got up from his seat. "Skinner, report to the security office," he said into his radio. He picked up his HKG-36 and readied it. A moment later, Skinner, a tall, broad-shouldered man with no hair on his head apart from bushy red eyebrows and a red handlebar mustache, entered the room. Skinner was one of the team under his command, and a good operator. Some drunk bums smashed the camera by one of the fire exits. "Stay here and man the desk while I sort this guy out." "You got it, boss," Skinner replied. He took the seat at the desk, and Knowles left the room. He jogged through the corridors towards the back of the building. Hopefully, at the sight of his assault rifle, the bum would think better of smashing up anything else and move on. If not, then he'd just have to rough him up a bit. Not like anyone would notice a drunken vagrant with a black eye or two. Those guys got wasted and beat the shit out of each other over the slightest minuscule amount of booze or drugs, or just because they were bored. Knowles hit the release bar and kicked the door open, coming face to face with the drunk, pipe still in his hands. "That's private property you just vandalized," he said to the bum. "This area's off limits. Get out of here." "Piss off," the bum replied. Knowles raised his rifle at the man, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I mean it, get lost." "Fuck you," the vagrant spat out, sending flecks of spittle flying into Knowles' face. That's it, he thought. He wasn't going to take that from a fucking drunken bum. Knowles unslung his rifle and moved towards the drunk. He raised his weapon and moved to strike him with the butt. Something moved behind him, and he felt a sharp crack on the back of his head. Stars exploded all around him, and Knowles' knees buckled beneath him in pain. A second strike smashed into the same spot, and Knowles fell unconscious into the vagrant's puddle of piss on the ground. Sarah crouched over Knowles' limp body and checked his pulse. He was alive. Ellison emerged from the shadows behind a dumpster and came up beside her. "Nice work." He handed the homeless man the $50 note as promised. The man took the bill, flashed them another toothless grin, and walked away without another word. Ellison wedged the lead pipe between the fire exit door and its frame, preventing it from closing as Sarah stripped the body of its assault rifle, pistol, and fished inside his pockets. She pulled out a wallet from his back pocket and opened it. Inside were the usual items, various cards, $120 in cash, and a photo of the man with a pretty brunette woman in her 40s and two teenage girls, both with the same dark hair as their mother. This guy had a family. Why the hell was he working for Kaliba? Sarah pulled out his driver's license and took a look. Andrew D. Knowles. Sarah committed the name to memory and pulled out the credit cards and cash and stuffed them into her pocket before throwing the wallet aside. She saw on his wrist was a fairly decent-looking watch. She took that too. They wanted to be in and out without anyone realizing they were ever there. Hopefully, when Andrew Knowles woke up with a headache and found his cash and credit cards missing, he'd just think he'd been robbed. With Knowles' weapons secured, Sarah and Ellison slipped into the building and closed the fire escape after them, sealing them inside the darkened corridor. In silence, they moved forwards as quickly as they could. Both had their pistols drawn down. Sarah let Ellison take the lead. She'd only been in the building once, and he knew his way around far better. "Where are we going?" Sarah whispered. "Basement," he replied. If these people were after John Henry, then they'd be downstairs trying to work out where he went. That's what he'd have done anyway. He led Sarah to the stairwell, still immersed in a dull red glow of the emergency lighting despite the blackout having ended and power being restored. Sarah guessed they kept the lights off so people would think the building had been abandoned. When they reached the basement level, Sarah shoved her Glock back into the waistband of her jeans, then unslung, and shouldered the HKG-36. She didn't know who or what they'd find in the basement, but she was glad of the extra firepower. If one of Kaliba's goons were armed with an assault rifle, then chances were all of them would be, and you couldn't fight automatics with handguns. Sarah took the lead this time, knowing where to go from here, and kept the assault rifle pointed forwards as she moved. They passed through the long corridor, turned a corner, and continued past the other doors to their left and right. They all looked the same, but Sarah knew exactly which room it was. You didn't forget the room where you lost your only son. As they grew closer, Sarah heard noise coming from the room, tapping on a keyboard and the snapping of someone connecting cables. She heard a single voice coming from the room. It sounded young. She stopped and remained still just a foot away from the door, which was ajar, and motioned for Ellison to stay behind her as she listened to the voice. After detailed analysis of all hardware and software, taking a couple of days now, the rogue AI appears to have vanished. The hardware appears to be an empty shell. I can't currently explain it. There should be at least some residual traces of the entity left on the systems, but there's nothing. It doesn't appear to have been erased or destroyed, as again that would still leave some files remaining. My current theory is that the AI has been transferred, somehow, onto new hardware, but I can't think of any portable device that could house an entire artificial intelligence and keep it functioning, nor where it's gone or why. Analysis of a second bank of terminals in the basement that appear unrelated to the AI is also inconclusive. Extensive damage has been done to the computer interfaces, and the hard drives have been smashed. Shot, to be more precise. Bullet casings are littered around the floor, and the screens have been shattered by gunfire. Someone didn't want us using whatever it was. Sarah didn't recognize the voice at all, but she got that it was one person, alone. That's all she needed to know for now. She turned to Ellison and held up 3 fingers. Ellison nodded. She counted down, 3, 2, 1. Sarah and Ellison burst into the room with their weapons raised. Inside was a young black man working on a laptop and holding a small digital dictaphone in one hand as he spoke into it. "Drop it," Sarah barked, pointing the rifle straight at his head. The young man looked up at her, and Ellison in horror. The dictaphone slipped from his grasp, and he raised both hands in the air. His eyes were wide and his mouth agape in terror. He trembled slightly. Who are you?" he asked. "Get up," Sarah instructed him harshly. He nodded and stood up off his chair, sending the laptop crashing to the floor. He was so focused on Sarah and Ellison holding weapons at him, he barely seemed to notice the computer. "Grab the laptop," Sarah told Ellison. He picked it up from the floor and closed it. "Who the hell are you?" Sarah asked. Danny Dyson," he replied. "Who are these people?" The woman looked familiar, but all he could focus on was the barrel of the gun pointed in his face. "We haven't got time for this," Ellison said. "Someone's going to notice the guy outside's been gone too long." "Who are you people?" Danny stared at Sarah, the gun, and Ellison, then back to the weapon. The weapon looked huge as he stared up its barrel. Sarah took the laptop from Ellison and shoved it into Danny's chest, forcing him to hold it in his hands. She tried to appear nonchalant about Danny Dyson, but inwardly her brain was racing away at 1,000,000 miles an hour. How was Danny involved with Kaliba? Why was he? Agent Aldridge had told her in jail that Danny had gone missing. She hadn't thought much about it, but now she realized they must have recruited him. It had to be because of Miles' work, surely. Whatever, she thought, that stuff could wait for now. They had more important things to worry about at the moment. Sarah shoved the rifle's barrel into Danny's cheek and glared at him. "You're coming with us," she ordered. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Danny snapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the radio. Knowles and his men would sort out whoever these people were. Sarah swung the rifle around and smashed the butt into Danny's solar plexus. He gasped out in pain as the air was forced from his lungs by the blow and fell to the floor in a heap. He let go of the radio, and it dropped from his hand onto the ground. Sarah stamped hard on it, cracking the casing and shattering the controls. Ellison stared at her but didn't say anything. They couldn't afford to look like they were divided, and he wasn't going to question her methods in front of Danny. They had to appear united. "Grab him," Sarah told Ellison. He picked Danny up off the floor and helped him to his feet. Sarah leaned close to the young man. "We're taking you with us. Call out or try to run and I'll shoot you." "Understand." Danny coughed violently as he struggled to suck air back into his lungs, but managed a weak nod. "How many more men are there?" Sarah asked. 6, Danny wheezed out. "We go back the way we came," Sarah told Ellison. She was tempted to knock Danny out to keep him quiet, torn between having either a potentially noisy hostage or having to carry out a deadweight. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt for now. She turned back to him and poked him roughly in the side of the head with the barrel. "Remember, you make a sound and I'll blow your head off." Danny nodded once again, and the trio quickly made their way out of the room John had left from and through the basement level up to the stairs. Danny wheezed and spluttered as Ellison dragged him faster to keep up with Sarah. Ellison could see the kid was clearly in pain, but he'd have to deal with it for now. It would only be a couple of minutes until they were back in the Mercedes. They made it up to the top of the stairs when the door leading to the ground floor proper opened, and a silhouette appeared from the dim light, a few feet away. "Who the fuck are you?" A voice snarled out. Sarah saw the figure raising a weapon, and she instinctively snapped up the rifle and fired twice. The rifle barked loudly, and viscera exploded from the man's back and splattered against the wall. He stayed upright for a moment before his brain realized he'd been shot, and he fell forwards. His chin smacked against the top step, and several teeth shattered, skittering out down several steps and dripped trails of blood in their wake. "We gotta move." Sarah snapped and stepped over the body, not checking to see if he was alive or not. Deep down, a part of her felt regret at having killed someone again, but she filed it away. There was no time to waste, and the other goons working for Kaliba would have heard the shot from a mile away. Ellison gripped Danny harder and followed after Sarah, dragging him alongside him as Sarah broke into a run. There was no time for stealth now. They just had to focus on getting out as fast as they could. Sarah noticed a fire alarm on the wall and smashed the glass with the rifle butt, then pulled the lever. A deafeningly high-pitched klaxon blared loudly all around them as she carried on towards the rear fire exit. She caught up with them as Ellison opened the exit and pushed Danny outside. Danny saw the still body of Knowles, laid out face down on the ground. "What did you do to him?" Danny asked, dreading the answer after seeing the woman callously blow away Michaels. He wasn't very fond of Knowles and his men, but neither did he want to see them killed. They were loud and crude and didn't much like him either, but he knew at least some of them had families. He knew Knowles did. "He'll be fine," Ellison said as Sarah closed the fire exit behind her. "Shut up and move," Sarah said to the pair of them. They didn't have time to talk. The three of them ran through the alleyway, with Sarah once again leading the way and Ellison making sure Danny didn't try to get away, intent on putting distance between the ZieraCorp tower and themselves. They emerged from the alleyway and into the street, and Sarah tossed the G-36 into a dumpster. They had enough guns now, and walking around the streets with an assault rifle would only attract unwanted attention. The last thing they needed was for some good citizen to call the cops and report a woman walking around armed to the teeth. That'd be a surefire way to bring half the LAPD down on them, and it'd only take them 5 minutes to realize who she was. "This way," Sarah said to Danny and pointed down the street. Danny just nodded, no longer winded but complying out of fear. "Good, Sarah, though. Let him be scared. It'll keep him in line." They made it back to the Mercedes and manhandled Danny into the back seat. Sarah took the wheel, whilst Ellison sat beside Danny in the rear. She pulled out of the multi-story parking lot and drove out onto the main road, heading back towards Ellison's house. She breathed out a sigh of relief when they were far enough away that the ZieraCorp tower was only one building among many, and they merged into the rest of the traffic on the road. Now they had Danny Dyson, caught working for Kaliba. Maybe she could get some answers as to the group trying to bring about Judgment Day and finally take the fight back to them.